Hello, Internet, and thank you very much for tuning into the Cloud Native Islamabad YouTube channel. And thank you very much for the community for supporting our efforts and watching us continuously what the things we actually coming towards you. So this is a webinar for the first time in 2024, webinar number one for 2024. But why I don't know why it's taking too much long because I actually was busy very much with the case city Islamabad, but we promise to make it more and more webinar flowing through in this channel in some upcoming months and years. So, with what are we covering today? A really interesting topic for everyone working in the development space. So we are covering SCORE. SCORE is an open source project, and we will try to understand how SCORE help you with the workload specification with your developer workflow and how it's removed the cognitive load associated with static configuration and how it's do it on a dynamic configuration mode. With that, I'm very much very lucky to have Suza, an open product manager at Humanitech, an open source contributor at Score, helping us understand the innovation in this space as well. Over to you, Suza.
Yeah, hi Simon. Thanks for having me. I'm Suza. I'm a product manager at Humanitech, and also a contributor to Score, the open source project we'll be talking about today. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here and looking forward to chatting with you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much once again joining. And I'm now sharing your screen on the slide on the screen. Hope everybody able to can see it. Let us know in the chat if you don't able to see it. And if you see some glitches in our voices or everything that not went according to the plan, please let us know in the comment as well. And please share your question as well, because we will be actually looking forward to your question as well. With that, over to you now, Suza, and we'll start talking about the agenda for today.
Cool. Yeah, sounds great. So today, we just want to go over a quick introduction. So understanding what workload specifications are before then actually diving into the fundamentals of SCORE, meaning its philosophy and concepts. Then getting a bit more hands-on and practical with implementation options, as in how can you actually integrate workload specifications such as SCORE into your workflow. And if there's time at the end, it would be great to just follow up with the project status, initiatives, roadmap items, and generally also opportunities for contribution in the community before then opening up for discussions. But feel free to also ask and raise questions, provide feedback throughout the webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And now we actually start the proceeding. So can you help us know, and let me please correct me if I'm wrong, what is SCORE? So SCORE allows developer to describe their workload and dependency as code once and run them across all the environment, and introduces a single chain to your setup by adding a score.yaml file to your workload repo. So over to you, Suza, how you describe the project today.
Yeah, totally. I mean, generally, a workload specification is essentially a list of requirements of how to run a workload. So it essentially allows developers to specify their workload's runtime requirements. In very simple words, that would be similar to like a recipe. And as you mentioned, the main goal really is to reduce cognitive load for developers. And that means that workload specifications in general, but also SCORE specifically, are quite simple by design. So they only expose common workload level entities, such as, the container image, environment variables, and dependencies, for example. And by being simple by design, essentially shielding complexity from the developers. There are many more features and benefits that we can dive into, such as separation of concerns or reducing the risk of configuration inconsistencies. But yeah, I think we'll dive into those deeper throughout the webinar.
Yes, absolutely. So another question I have in my mind is, what is a workload spec and what benefit does it have?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that very much is in line with how I just described SCORE. I mean, there are different types of workload specification tools out there, but generally, I would say a workload specification, it's always essentially just a file that allows developers to describe a workload's runtime requirement in one way or another.
Absolutely, that's pretty much absolutely, but that's pretty much what I'm actually looking for. And now, I think, can you help us on the next topic? And that's very much a lot of the people might have, and looking forward to see what the people see in the chat as well. So we have some static configuration and we have some declarative configuration or dynamic configuration. So how does SCORE deal with configuration management?
So I can quickly jump forward just to illustrate that a bit more in detail. SCORE embraces the concept of dynamic configuration management. So that essentially means that the configuration described in SCORE is environment agnostic. You you can see it in the example here. Unfortunately, it's not fully visible, but the configuration is described in form of placeholders. So the idea here really is that the actual values and secrets are injected in the target environment. That essentially allows to capture everything that is kind of changing depending on the environment you deploy to. So looking at this example here with the database connection string, of course, you want to have different values on dev versus production, for example. So that's kind of the thought process behind the dynamic configuration management, that this is not hard-coded inside the workload specification, but ideally kind of dynamically injected depending on the platform and environment that you run on.
Absolutely, that makes perfect sense for me as well. So I think like, and as we're talking about the concept of dynamic configuration management, and we see some of the orgs and some of the developers are still using some sort of static configuration management, and they happen to live in this world till now. So I see a little bit of pain of doing this workload management via static configuration that is lacks some kind of scalability and agility and some sort of configuration drift if you do a static style way. And then there's a lack of automation and self-service capabilities. And we'll literally see a move from going forward towards dynamic and automated approach to configuration management can achieve maintainability and productivity and agility and reliability for the modern software development. So, what is your key takeaways on this conversation on or comparison of two way of thinking about doing workload specification via static and dynamic?
Yeah, I would totally agree with the bottlenecks that you raised. I mean, dynamic configuration management essentially avoids you to, I mean, the main thing that it tries to address is the bottlenecks that a lot of teams face with it today, right? You have loads of overwrite files, different scripts that inject things here and there, and it just often ends up in a mess where it's really hard to understand which variable needs to be updated in which environment and who's responsible for that and how to actually keep things in sync between environments. And having that kind of concept of dynamic configuration management baked into your platform helps to avoid that. But that, of course, is easier said than done. It does come with kind of certain requirements in terms of the platforms. And by platform, I mean your internal developer platform, its capabilities. So there needs to be some kind of system in place that actually allows you to detect the correct values that need to be injected. And that should happen, of course, consistently from local environments up to production environments. And I think, yeah, once that is achieved, I think then we can move away from all these headaches that static configuration management include.
Yes, absolutely. And I think now we come to the point where I try to understand how score does work today and what are the different vocabulary that is bringing to the table for me to understand its some of the architecture consideration and some of the concept behind it. So how does scores work today?
Yeah, so we can quickly go back to what is shown on the slide here. So to essentially characterize the score specification, which is essentially just quote unquote the specification file, is developer centric, platform agnostic, and declarative. So that's part of the design principles that we just talked about. Developer centric, meaning that it is simple by design. Developers can easily request kind of their workloads runtime requirements. Looking at the file here again, you can see it's as easy as defining an image, container overrides, environment variables, and requesting dependencies. So looking at the resources section down here, it's as easy as saying my workload depends on a Postgres dependency. And that's kind of the level of abstraction we're aiming for here. And another feature that we haven't discussed yet is the fact that Score is platform agnostic. So it essentially has the opportunity to integrate with various container orchestration and tooling. So it's not tied to a specific platform. It works with Docker Compose, Kubernetes Helm, or all kinds of other tooling that you can think of. And then, of course, yeah, it's declarative. So that just means the developer essentially can request or describe what their workload requires to run. But going back to your question, we can move on to the next slide in terms of how does SCORE actually work. Having a specification file where you describe your runtime requirements is great, but of course you need to do something with that file. So this overview here is quite helpful, essentially explaining that the SCORE specification can be run against a SCORE CLI to generate a platform configuration file. So what we're seeing here is the SCORE specification that is then executed against a SCORE implementation, such as SCORE Compose or SCORE Helm. This is a form of CLI tool. So, and this CLI tool takes in the SCORE specification and then generates the required platform configuration file. And I think it's important to note that by design, each workload has one SCORE file with it. So, and this one SCORE file can be executed against several implementations, and based on that, generating different outputs. So here in these examples, we have SCORE Compose, which would accordingly generate a Docker Compose file, and for SCORE Helm, a values file, and the list will continue depending on the implementation you actually go with.
Got it. So now I think it's very clear in the picture, like how the flow actually work. So might some people have question like you create a score.yaml file. Basically, you don't need to learn anything new. If you already been using or coming from the YAML background, that's none of the skill set required because it's already using the syntax of the YAML. So how does like you have to convert your score into the score compose via some sort of CLI, and then it's translated those into the Docker compose, and then then you actually deploy into the cluster, or you can into a values dot YAML and this. So this is actually the flow looks like. Now might be some people are having some question around this area, like if you are having some hierarchies between association between different resources. Let's say you create a resource and that's underneath has two dependencies, and how does like is there an association or is there a hierarchy that exists in the score spectrum, or does actually is a separation of concern between app developers and the platform? So who is actually responsible for writing a score YAML and who is responsible for translating the YAML and deploying into the cluster?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, the whole idea here is to shift complexity in the right way. So as you mentioned, like for the developer, ideally they just specify what their workload needs to run, and that's usually like a dependency on a database or a dependency on another workload. What happens behind the scenes, like how that workload is provisioned, how that resource is provisioned or allocated, and if that depends on other active resources in the platform, that is very much a platform concern. So that's kind of the whole idea behind SCORE, that you no longer have to worry about these implementation details that might be specific to the environment or specific to the platform or the infrastructure provider that actually is responsible for putting that all into practice. And that's where we kind of get into the self-service principle, where developers just request something and the platform on the receiving end is quote unquote smart enough to resolve this and then do its magic to actually fulfill those requirements specified in the file.
Got it. Now, I think that another universal question come into my mind is that, so is the generated platform configuration file or deployment ready?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that genuinely, in most cases, no. If you have let's say you're working in a very simple setup, you're just starting to play around, maybe with a hello world scenario, then that would probably work. But if you work with SCORE at scale, and let's say you work with a container orchestrator like Kubernetes, in practice, there's likely additional configuration required to actually get your workload running. And that's again where we get into the separation of concerns, right? So the developer owns and specifies workload-related configuration, and that can then be combined with environment and platform-specific configuration. So there might be, looking at the configuration options that Kubernetes offers, there's a lot of them, and they will be managed by the platform team for the most part. And that's where kind of both can be merged together then to actually get the workload running effectively, if that makes sense. Oh, you're muted, Sam. Yeah.
Thanks for telling me. Yes, absolutely. That makes perfect sense the way the flow actually works. So I think the next question from my side is, so how do you ensure with SCORE that workload specification align with the project objective and requirements?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say genuinely SCORE as a workload specification, as any other workload specification, wants to introduce a standard for defining workloads, right? So if teams actually want to embrace developer experience, dynamic configuration management, workload-centric development, all of these things that we're talking about, then the idea is that you adopt SCORE or the workload spec you're working with as your standard, and then build your platform around it. That being said, in practice and in reality, of course, you are likely to have specific requirements when it comes to the level of abstraction or just even configuring individual properties in a specific way that the default SCORE spec doesn't do as you expect. Then there's always the option to extend the SCORE file. So currently we work with a simple extensions file that you can add, and that can essentially like patch additional configuration on top. So that's one workaround at the moment, and we're actually getting a lot of feedback on this because people not only want to extend or customize, they also sometimes want to even simplify further. And as part of that problem space, we're actually exploring the option of an IDE plugin where platform engineers or development teams in general could specify standards for validation, auto-completion, or general like input rules, allowing for further control and customization there as well.
Okay, got it. And Now the next question is, which score implementations are available today?
Yeah, great question. So you're seeing on the diagram here Score Compose and Score Helm. These are the two main reference implementations that Score offers. So I'm saying reference implementation here because they can be used as a reference. That means teams can start to play around with them if they fit their use case, potentially extend them. But the idea is really the third point here, where we have a lot of room for further platforms. So next to these two kind of baseline implementations, we're encouraging people to write their own CLIs, essentially then allowing them to execute and process the score file in a way that fits their use case and also allows the platform on the receiving end to process it as expected. For example, we at Humanitech have our own Score Humanitech implementation that works with our product, the platform orchestrator, quite well. So we made some tweaks there. We're also currently using the extensions file that I mentioned before. And from the community, I've heard a few POCs in progress. I think there's something going on in terms of Google Cloud Run and then also Fly.io. So it's great to see that there's some experimentation going on. But yeah, we're highly encouraging people to dive in there and try things out. Yeah.
Yes, and I think the next question is very much I wanted to learn from you. So as the project is going and going away, and now it's actually making some progress and momentum, what do you think the score concepts and philosophy, where it's actually going?
Yeah, that's a great point and actually a perfect transition to this next slide here. So I think, yeah, it's a natural question, as you said. First, understanding the spec and what it does, you might now wonder, like, what are we actually trying to solve here? And there are a few pain points that kind of build the foundation for Score. So like taking a step back, the initial problems that we noticed and saw in the industry are that cloud native developers struggle with increased cognitive load due to kind of tech and tools that require specialized knowledge. To put it in simple terms, like cloud native development can be quite complicated, and developers are often no longer in a place where they're just writing code. They're often exposed to infrastructure and orchestration tooling, such as we talked about at Kubernetes, Helm, and all of these tools that just lead to less focused coding time. They tend to be blocked by infrastructure work, configuration work, all that kind of stuff. And that relates to the next point. So you then end up having these different configuration rules and values between environments in place that just increase the risk of configuration inconsistencies. So I think developers are quite familiar with the problem of moving to production, meaning that it gets a little more complicated, right? So locally, you're using a lightweight tool such as Docker Compose. But then in the remote environment, you're suddenly faced with additional tooling. You might run, I don't know, your integration tests on Google Cloud Run and then deploy to Kubernetes with Helm or Kustomize, provision your resources with Terraform, and this switch from kind of platform to platform in different environments just increases the risk of configuration inconsistencies. So that was kind of the big question that we tried to solve. How can you keep your configuration consistent between environments that run on different platforms? Exactly. So that's kind of the summary of the first 2 points. Before I move on, do you have any questions on that?
Yes, I think I try to add because I experiment some of the stuff with the score on my some of my demos project. So I think like score is trying to do the developer's cognitive load is we actually and try to relate as that the cognitive load is influenced by complexity, ambiguity, and uncertainty inherent in software development. So, managing cognitive load effectively is crucial for maintaining productivity, creativity, and well being in the fast paced and demanding environments for software development. So, with SCORE, developer can translate their spec to Docker Compose for local development and to Kubernetes or Helm or similar for remote production environment without risking configuration inconsistencies is a step towards maintaining productivity, creativity, and well-being in the fast-paced, demanding environment for software development. So that's my personal key takeaway for where I see the project fits best in. But now I wanted to switch things around how the integration score, how score is integrating into your workflow. So we naturally will try to understand how the score and platform piece work together. And that's where Susa can help us understand how scores and the platform flows together.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, once you understand SCORE, your next question, of course, is how do I integrate it or a workload spec genuinely into my workflow, and how does this look in practice? Um, and I prepared this slide here. I think generally the question is always about where do you shift complexity? And I know this is pretty abstract, but I think it's important to acknowledge that SCORE, of course, does rely on a platform on the receiving end that is actually able to process the generated configuration file. And with that, do things like resolve dependencies and inject values and secrets, for example. So the idea here is not just because that is often actually a question that we receive. We're not by introducing SCORE, we're trying to simplify things for developers because they are experiencing increased cognitive load. But by that, we don't mean that we're throwing it back over the wall to platform engineers. So kind of in the spirit of platform engineering, the idea very much is that complexity is shifted down onto the platform. And for the developer, we have abstraction, and for the platform engineer, standardization through that. But yeah, as I mentioned, this is, of course, just a very theoretical explanation. And I can quickly show a more practical blueprint here. Sorry, I'll just show that fully. This is something that a colleague of mine prepared. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that there are more tangible kind of reference architectures out there of how SCORE can work and how this the big gap of the what is the platform on the receiving end can be answered. And there are many different ways to do that. I just didn't want to take up too much time with that. I think we could technically have a whole nother webinar on that with a deep dive on how that can look in practice. But what I'll do is just share the link to a recording for a demo that actually includes this diagram here just for the audience to see if they're interested in how this can look in practice.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a natural alignment with the project as well, because it's do some of the stuff that is actually currently is pretty much in the investment for a lot of the platform space as well. So now the next question is, does this mean that you need a fully formed internal developer platform in place to adopt Score?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I know that with SCORE, I mean, to go back to the basics, SCORE is just a specification file, right? So it doesn't do any of the heavy lifting for you in that sense. And that means the implementation of the SCORE spec is on you. There's no prescribed target state. But the idea in theory, of course, is that you have SCORE shape kind of the form and behavior of your IDP. So what we talked about before, ideally things such as injecting values and secrets or provisioning a database can actually happen in an automated and standardized way to enable self-service for developers. But that's, yeah, of course, in just the ideal target state you're working towards. If you're starting off, of course, you'll have some glue in place. You're writing a few scripts. You might have manual interactions in place to make that work in the short term. So I think you don't need a fully formed IDP, but SCORE can kind of provide some guiding principles on the way, allowing you to embrace concepts such as dynamic configuration management and other things we talked about before.
Yes, absolutely. Now we're moving our conversation towards, I think that is another question actually while working with SCORE, I came up in my mind that are there any specific strategies or best practice you follow to ensure the effective implementation of workload specification within your team or organization?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, genuinely, of course, there are certain characteristics that you can pay attention to, like if platform agnosticism is something that's important to you, or easy integration and onboarding, those would be like very tool-specific characteristics that you can orient towards. But I do think that for the spec, which in practice will become part of your IDP, the notion of treating your platform as a product applies here as well. So instead of kind of starting with the tool and understanding its capabilities, it's probably best to start with the users, in that case, your developers' pain points and use cases, and then from there, see if those align with the tool you're looking at. I mean, SCORE is not the only workload spec out there. There are similar projects that are slightly different in scope and use case. So I think, yeah, it's just a matter of really understanding like which problem are you trying to solve? What is like the underlying root case? And then does like the philosophy, the concepts, the use cases that we're describing, does that align with what you're seeing in your team? I think that's always a more sensible approach than kind of starting with the tool and then trying to impose that top down rather than having it be more like developer driven, essentially.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I think before I let you go and we wrap up the conversation here, how score look in practice?
You mean when it comes to kind of the project status at the moment, or more implementation focused?
Yes, I think a kind of a mix between the project focus and some implementation phase.
Yeah, for sure. We can maybe dive into the next section for that, and then if there are any implementation specific details, we can look at those further. Um, so in terms of the status of our project, as I mentioned initially, we submitted SCORE to the CNCF sandbox early this year. It was a really exciting milestone for us. We intended to, or we're hoping that that will help with driving adoption across the community. So what I mentioned before in terms of the SCORE CLI implementations, we're seeing people experiment, but it would definitely be great to see further adoptions with further platforms out there. And then, of course, also moving the community discussion on topics such as platform maturity, the right level of abstraction, and how the notion of a workload spec actually fits into the landscape. From my point of view, the discussions we're having within the SCORE community are quite aligned and similar to what we're seeing in the CNCF community. So it's already been really helpful to get feedback from everyone, and like drive the discussions forward and find more tangible answers for those. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear also from your point of view in terms of the CNCF discussions, and how that all fits in there.
Yes,
Now you'll
absolutely.
be.
Because we work on the CNCF ambassadorship side as well. Oh, got it. So I'm just saying, like, it's a very good project, and it's been a very unique and in some of its philosophy and the way it's worked today. And also because we live in the ambassadorship role, so we are able to meet with some of the community folks to understand where the community is heading. So I think the score is focused on finding the right level of abstraction for developers, so effectively separating their concern from the platform and infrastructure related complexities. So this is leading to developer centric, platform agnostic, environment agnostic, and the philosophy going through for platform developer that accelerates productivity, creativity, and developer well-beings. So if you want your team to concentrate on managing workload while ensuring compatibility across different platforms, whether local or remote, such as Docker Compose and Helm? If so, I believe Score might be the ideal solution for you. And the ideal place for Score is for to go in the hand of CNCF community who can better accelerate with work with the community and enhance his capabilities as well. So good luck with the CNCF sandbox acquisition. Hopefully, it will be a sandbox project as well. So final question, few questions to wrap up. So
Mhm.
can you share, Souza, a roadmap for Score and what's coming up in near future?
Yeah, for sure. Let's do that. Just one more note that I forgot to point out this QR code here in case anyone is wondering what that is about. It's just a link to a blog post on the CNCF submission, just in case anyone is interested about finding more about that. But cool, yeah, let's move on to the roadmap, as you said. So there are a few items on our roadmap that you'll also find on our GitHub repos. We're currently looking into a more generalized score extension mechanism. That's a use case we touched on before. How can you actually make sure that score aligns with your project objectives and requirements? Right now, it's extension file, as I mentioned, but it would be great to have more of an extension store in place that allows you to plug in additional properties in a more transparent way. And then, of course, more score implementation CLIs. We already talked about that. And then we would like to improve the score developer documentation, essentially more hand-on tutorials, and also giving more guidance to users on how to actually write their own implementations. And next to the roadmap items, of course, we have a bunch of open and ongoing issues and discussions on GitHub. So there are a lot of bugs and feature requests. That's probably an easier point to get started for anyone who's interested in contributing to the open source project. And next to that, yeah, on the product side, we're looking into an initiative called Project Melody, which aims to improve ease of use, consistency, and customization. In the slide before, I showed that Score was launched end of 2022, so it's definitely still quite young still. And while the reference implementation, like they functionally work, we're now at a place where we like to improve user experience. So actually making a few things a little bit more smoother, having sensible defaults in place, and allowing for easier onboarding. So those are kind of the moving parts. And then, of course, now that we're a bit more involved with the CNCF community, we've got really good feedback already. So anyone open to playing around with the tools, it's always really helpful for us to see where people get stuck and how we can make things better.
Absolutely. And before final question is how do people meet with some of the folks from Score community in the upcoming KubeCon Paris? And some points on some contribution where to go and start contributing.
Cool. Yeah. Let's look into that. That should be here on the next slide. So I think the starting point for everything really is the Score spec repository on GitHub. We'll link out to anything relevant from there. But of course, when it comes to contribution, as I mentioned before, we have a bunch of open issues in place. You can collaborate with us on roadmap initiatives. If it's a bigger item, we're very much open to actually actively collaborate with you to get started. As I mentioned, our documentation, there is some room for improvement. So often it just requires a bit more of a, I don't know, like manual or personal approach to getting these done. And then also you can get in touch during our office hours on Slack. So you can reach out to me or my colleagues in the CNCF Slack, but we also have a separate community Slack specific to SCORE in place. And in terms of KubeCon, there will be a small SCORE stand associated with the Humanitech booth. And we're also hoping to get some conversations going with the other CNCF folks. Of course, also in the context of our submission and kind of understanding how we can clarify things further or if there are any missing contributions.
Thank you very much, Suza. It's been a wonderful talking with you and learning about it. And after the conversation and after playing with the tool yesterday, it's kind of a unique conjunction that is try to fill in some of the very old pain that the developer had that can be removed significantly with the usage of this tool as well. So philosophically and strategically, it has so much values in it, and I'm looking forward to have this being the CNCF incubation style sandbox project becomes. And if people want to contribute, these are the links for you as well. And do meet some of the folks from Humanitech and Secure community in the upcoming KubeCon as well. So with that, I will let the people know this is our part one of the webinar, and we try to do it in a uniquely different style because the last year and the years before, we did a hands-on style webinars, and then there are some questions we couldn't actually capture for just 1 hour. So this time we take another opportunity to make a question style focus first one. So you're able to understand what the philosophy of the project is, what the pain point it's solving, and why should developer invest time learning this tool. So this is for you to understand why you should invest time learning about it. And in the upcoming webinar, we will do a hands-on with the same team to understand how this thing work in practice. And with some of your comments on this YouTube channel, we will try to see what is the best content we put together in upcoming webinars. So remember, make sure you have come to this channel for this webinar number 2 that is more around hands-on style as well. With that, Susa, in anything before we actually conclude the conversation?
No, nothing from my side. As you mentioned, I think this format is really great. I do have to say, in previous webinars, when we kind of tried to include both the kind of product introduction and then a demo, it does feel very condensed, and I think it's a great idea to spread it out and give people some time to digest. And yeah, anyone who's interested, definitely feel free to provide input for any follow-up webinars, demos that you would like to see, and then we could definitely dive deeper there. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Thank you very much, Suza. It's been a pleasure talking to you today, and hope to meet soon in some of the other conversation as well. But I learned a lot about SCORE, and this is the project website. You have to go through and watch some of the contribution blog post because you have to might have some question around how this is different from other workload specification. So blogs are written in the website with very concise information as well. So please read that and check that out, and do let us know what you think about it. And this is the blog that the Susa mentioning they are applied for the CNCF Sandbox project. And there are a bunch of the links I will be included in the YouTube chat as well. But with thank you very much, Susa, and thank you everyone listening to us. And if you're watching this recording or have some questions, feel free to reach out to Susa either on the platform engineering Slack channel on the Humanitech side or on the CNCF Slack channel on the CNCF side. So she will be happy to help you out as well. Or if you want to touch with me, there's a Twitter handle for me as well. So with that, once again, it's been a great talking to you. It's a great start for my webinar series for 2024. Hope to meet you again soon. Have a wonderful day. Bye bye.
Thanks so much. Bye bye.